The silence was the heaviest thing in the apartment. It had been a week since the funerals, a week since the world had fractured, leaving them suspended in a strange muted space between what was and what would be. The air in their Lyon apartment, usually thick with the sweet resinous scent of their father's violin workshop and the warm spice of their mother's cooking, now smelled only of dust and wilting flowers. Grief was a physical presence settling in the corners and clinging to the velvet curtains their mother had loved. Alara Nouri at 19 felt the weight of that silence more than anyone. It pressed on her shoulders a responsibility far heavier than her slender frame should have been able to bear. She looked at her 3 younger brothers scattered like fallen leaves in the living room. Rayan, the youngest at 11, was curled on the floor, his finger tracing the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, a relic of their father's heritage. His small shoulders trembled almost imperceptibly. "Will we still live here, Alara?" he asked, his voice a small, hopeful whisper that threatened to break her heart. Before she could answer, Sammy, 13, and armed with a defiant humor that was his only shield, chimed in. "Of course we will, dummy. Who else is going to listen to Madame Dubois complain about the pigeons?" He tried for a grin, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Alara managed a weak smile for him. "Sammy's right, Rayan. This is our home." She said the words with more conviction than she felt a promise to them and to the ghosts of her parents. Kareem, 15, and already burdened with the solemnity of a man, said nothing. He simply watched Alara from the armchair where their father used to sit, his dark eyes filled with a worry that mirrored her own. In his silent gaze, she found a strange comfort. They were in this together. The sharp, insistent buzz of the intercom sliced through the quiet, making them all jump. "Who is it?" Rayan asked, scrambling closer to Alara. "I don't know, mon petit," she murmured, her stomach clenching. They weren't expecting anyone. The torrent of well-meaning neighbors with their casseroles and condolences had finally trickled to a stop. She pressed the talk button. "We?" A voice, smooth and clipped, crackled through the speaker. "Alara, it's your Uncle Antoine. Luke is with me. Let us in." It wasn't a request. A cold knot formed in Alara's stomach. Uncle Antoine and Uncle Luc Rousseau, her mother's brothers, were men carved from a different stone than her own family. They were French through and through, with a lineage as old and unyielding as the cobblestone streets in the city center. They had attended the funeral in impeccable dark suits, their sympathy as thin and brittle as glass. They had looked at Alara and her brothers with their Algerian father's dark hair and olive skin as if they were unfortunate exotic curiosities their sister had collected. Alara buzzed them in a sense of dread washing over her. Kareem stood up instinctively, moving to her side. When she opened the door, they filled the frame 2 imposing figures who seemed to suck the warmth from the hallway. Antoine, the elder, was handsome in a severe way, his silvering hair perfectly coiffed. Luc was leaner, quieter, his stillness more unnerving than his brother's confident posture. He didn't smile, he observed. Alara, ma chérie Antoine, began stepping inside without being invited. His expensive leather shoes were silent on the rug. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the half-packed boxes and the general air of sorrowful disarray with faint disapproval. A difficult time. Uncle Alara said, her voice steady. "What can we do for you?" Antoine ignored the question, his eyes settling on Kareem. "You boys should go to your room. We need to speak with your sister about adult matters." "We're staying," Kareem said, his voice low but firm. He did not move from Alara's side. Antoine's lips thinned, but he turned his attention back to Alara. "Very well. Alara, we have been reviewing your parents' affairs. It is more complicated than we thought. Your father, for all his artistic talent, was not a practical man. Papa was meticulous." Alara countered, a spark of anger cutting through her fear. He handled everything. Did he? Luke spoke for the first time, his voice a low rasp. He held up a leather briefcase. "Because what we have found is a portfolio of debt, a significant mortgage on this apartment, loans. It seems your mother's little restaurant was not as successful as she led everyone to believe. The estate is for all intents and purposes insolvent." The word hung in the air, ugly and foreign. Insolvent, bankrupt. It didn't make sense. Their parents had never been lavish, but they had been secure. Their father was a celebrated luthier, his violin sought after by musicians across Europe. Their mother's restaurant had been her passion, a small but beloved place, always filled with happy customers. "No," Alara whispered. "That's not possible. There's a mistake." "There is no mistake," Antoine said, his tone devoid of any gentleness. "The reality is you cannot afford to live here. The bank will foreclose. You have nothing." He let the words land with calculated cruelty. As your closest living relatives, your legal guardians, it is our duty to handle this. We will be selling the apartment and its contents to settle the debts. The room began to tilt. Sell everything, their home, the violins in their father's workshop, their mother's recipe books. You can't, Alara said, her voice rising. This was a violation, a desecration of their memory. This is our home. Papa and Maman left it to us. They left you nothing but bills, you foolish girl. Antoine snapped, his facade of civility cracking. You are a 19-year-old child with 3 boys to care for. You have no job, no money. How do you propose to survive? We are trying to protect you by throwing us onto the street. Alara shot back, her grief now forged into rage. She took a step forward, shielding her brothers with her body. You will not touch anything in this house. You will not sell our father's legacy to pay for debts that don't exist. Get out. For a moment, Antoine looked genuinely shocked by her defiance. His face, handsome and controlled, twisted into an ugly mask of fury. You ungrateful little... He moved faster than she could have imagined. His hand swung through the air. The sound was sharp, a crack that sliced through the heavy silence. Alara's head snapped to the side, a blinding, stinging pain exploding on her cheek. The shock was so profound, it took a second to register what had happened. Her uncle had slapped her. The world went silent. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. She saw Rayon's mouth open in a silent gasp, his eyes wide with terror. She saw Karim take a protective step forward, his hands clenched into fists, his face a storm of disbelief and rage. Slowly, Alara turned her head back to face her uncle. The print of his fingers was a fire on her skin. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She met his cold, furious gaze with a stillness of her own, a resolve hardening within her like cooling steel. He had expected tears pleading. He had not expected this quiet, unbreakable defiance. The storm had broken not outside but within the 4 walls of their home, and Alara knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The echo of the slap lingered long after the stinging on Alara's cheek had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. It hung in the air, a permanent crack in the foundation of their world. After a moment of stunned silence, Antoine had straightened his jacket, his expression one of irritation, as if Alara's face had inconvenienced his hand. We will be back tomorrow with our solicitor to formalize the arrangements, he'd said, his voice clipped and final. Be sensible. Then they were gone, leaving a vacuum where the warmth of family should have been. The moment the door clicked shut, Rayan burst into tears, a series of ragged, terrified sobs. Sammy, for once, without a joke, put a fierce protective arm around him, but it was Karim who moved first towards Alara. He didn't say a word. He gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, and led her to the sofa. The gesture was small, but it was everything. It said, I am with you. I see you. That night no one slept. The 3 boys crammed into Karim's bed, a silent, huddled fortress of brotherhood. Alara sat in the dark living room, her throbbing cheek a constant reminder. The physical pain was nothing compared to the cold dread that had taken root in her soul. They were coming back. This was not over. True to his word, Antoine returned the next morning. He and Luc were not alone. With them was a man in a rumpled suit carrying a worn briefcase, whom Antoine introduced as Maître Moreau. The solicitor did not look Alara in the eye. He had the weary, disinterested air of a man who had seen too many family tragedies and had long since ceased to be moved by them. They sat at the dining table, the polished wood reflecting their grim faces. Maître Moreau spread out a series of documents, their pages filled with dense, intimidating text. Mademoiselle Nouri, the solicitor, began, his voice a dry monotone. Your uncles have retained me to manage the estate of your late parents. As you can see from these statements, the liabilities far exceed the assets. The mortgage on this property is in significant arrears. He slid a paper towards her, a blur of figures and official letterheads. Given that you and your brothers are minors, with the exception of yourself, who has only just reached majority, the court appoints your uncles as next of kin as temporary administrators. But we have a family solicitor. Maître Bernard Ilara protested, the name feeling like a lifeline. Papa trusted him with everything. Maître Moreau gave a small, dismissive shrug. Maître Bernard has been informed. He is an old man, not equipped for a complex insolvency case like this. Everything is in order. He tapped a final document. This is a notice of eviction. The property must be vacated to be sold. You have 3 days to remove your personal belongings. 3 days, 72 hours to dismantle a life. The words didn't seem real. This is wrong, Karim said, his voice shaking with a fury he could barely contain. My father would never leave us in debt. He was an artist, but he was not a fool. The documents do not lie, young man Maitre Moreau said coolly, already packing his briefcase, his job done. After they left, the 3-day countdown began, a ticking clock in the center of their grief. Packing was an act of archaeology, of excavating layers of memory. Every object was a wound. The half-finished violin on their father's workbench, its pale wood waiting for a voice he would never give it. The small, colorful spice jars in the kitchen that their mother had brought back from a trip to Algiers, still faintly aromatic. The faded height chart penciled onto a doorframe, marking the growth of 3 boys and a girl who were now orphans. Alara worked with a numb, frantic energy, directing her brothers to pack only what was essential: clothes, school books, a few precious keepsakes. The rest, the furniture, the art, the vast library of books, the very soul of their home, had to be left behind for the auctioneers. The final day was gray and damp, a miserable lion drizzle coating the city in a sheen of gloom. A battered, unmarked truck was parked in the courtyard below its presence, in open declaration of their shame. As they carried the last of their boxes and bags downstairs, Alara felt the weight of 100 hidden glances. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains. Madame Dubois, their elderly downstairs neighbor, stood on her balcony. Her arms crossed her face, a mask of stern disapproval that Alara couldn't decipher. Was it disapproval of them, or for them Antoine and Luc were there supervising? They stood by the building's entrance, smoking, their posture radiating a smug sense of ownership. They didn't help. They watched. It was Rayan who broke. Overwhelmed by the finality of it all, he dropped his small backpack and ran back to the apartment's front door, his small hands clinging to the heavy wood. No, he cried, his voice echoing in the stone courtyard. I want to stay here. I want Maman. Alara rushed to him, her heart aching. Rayan, mon chou, we have to go. We'll be together. That's what matters. But he was inconsolable, his small body shaking with grief and fear. He wouldn't let go of the door. Luc, who had been watching the scene with cold detachment, dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. He walked over his steps, deliberate. He didn't say a word to Alara. He simply reached down and took hold of Rayan's shoulder. Stop this nonsense, he said, his voice low and devoid of all emotion. And then he pushed him. It wasn't a violent shove, not an act of rage like Antoine's slap. It was something worse, a firm, impersonal, dismissive gesture, the kind one might use to move an object, not a weeping child. Rayan stumbled backward, his feet tangling, and fell onto the cold, wet flagstones of the courtyard. A collective gasp went through the unseen audience behind the windows. Madame Dubois took a sharp step forward on her balcony. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The drizzling rain, the city noise, the whispers, it all vanished. All Alara saw was her little brother on the ground, his face a mess of tears, shock, and scraped hands. A fire, cold and absolute, ignited in her chest. The shame she had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, diamond-hard resolve. She ran to Rayan, scooping him up into her arms and holding him tight, her body a shield against the world. She met Luc's indifferent gaze over her brother's trembling head. Her own eyes were dry, burning with a promise he could not possibly comprehend. She would not forget this. She would not forget the slap. She would not forget the fall. Without another word, she carried Rayan to the waiting taxi, Karim and Sammy following close behind like a silent guard of honor. As the car pulled away from the curb, turning its back on the only home they had ever known, Alara looked at the reflection in the rain-streaked window. She saw 4 orphans huddled together, leaving their past behind. But in her own reflection, she no longer saw the face of a girl. She saw the face of a fighter. The fall was complete. Now the climb would begin. The taxi drove them away from the historic heart of Lyon, away from the warm, honey-colored stone of the Presqu'île and the familiar grace of their old neighborhood. With every kilometer, the elegant Haussmannian buildings gave way to a starker, more modern geometry. They were heading towards the banlieues, the concrete collar that encircled the city's affluent core. Their destination was a complex called Les Verrières. The name, the Glass Houses, was a cruel piece of poetry for a place made almost entirely of concrete. It was a forest of gray residential towers 10 stories high, stretching towards the sky like monoliths. Graffiti, vibrant and angry, covered the lower walls in a language of its own. The taxi driver, a man with tired eyes, pulled up to the curb and said nothing as Alara counted out the fare, her hands trembling slightly. He didn't offer to help with the bags, he just wanted to leave. "This is it?" Sammy asked, his voice uncharacteristically small. He stared up at the imposing building in front of them, number C7. "This is it," Alara confirmed, forcing a brightness into her tone that felt like a lie. "It's an adventure." The lobby smelled of damp concrete and harsh disinfectant. The lift rattled and groaned its way down to the sous-sol, the semi-basement level. Their apartment 0B was at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The air was cool and still. When Alara turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open, the reality of their new life hit them with the force of a physical blow. The apartment was tiny. A small living area flowed into a kitchenette with old, mismatched appliances. 2 cramped bedrooms branched off the main space. The floor was covered in cracked yellowing linoleum. The walls were painted a sickly shade of beige with faint water stains blooming near the ceiling. But the worst part was the window. There was only one, a long, narrow rectangle set high in the wall, offering a bleak view of the concrete walkway outside and the legs of people passing by. It let in a grudging gray light that seemed to be swallowed by the room's shadows. The apartment smelled of mildew and years of stale cooking. Rayan instinctively shrank back, clinging to Alara's coat. Kareem's face was a stony mask, his jaw tight as he surveyed the space. Sammy, ever the performer, broke the heavy silence. "Well," he declared, dropping his bag with a thud, "at least we won't have to worry about getting a sunburn." Alara was grateful for his attempt at humor, but the joke fell flat in the oppressive air. That first night was the longest of her life. The boys huddled together in one small bedroom, leaving the other for her. But she didn't sleep. She lay on a bare mattress on the floor, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Les Verrières, the distant wail of a siren, the muffled bass of a neighbor's music, the shouting from a dispute somewhere in the courtyard. These were the sounds of a world built on survival, a world they had been thrown into without a map. She pulled out her phone, the screen's glow harsh in the darkness. She checked her bank account. After paying the first month's rent and the deposit, she had exactly 412 euros left. 412 euros to feed, clothe, and care for 3 growing boys. The number was an insult, a death sentence. A sob caught in her throat, hot and painful, but she choked it down. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, she took a deep, shuddering breath and made a decision. It was a choice that felt like cutting off a limb to save the body. She opened her laptop, the university's crest on the login page, a mocking reminder of a future that now belonged to someone else. She had been in her second year at the Université Lumière Lyon 2, studying to be a teacher. Her dreams had been filled with classrooms, books, and the joy of opening young minds. Now that life seemed like a distant, beautiful fiction. With methodical, heartbreaking keystrokes, she composed an email to the registrar's office, formally withdrawing from her studies. Due to a sudden and irreversible change in family circumstances, the moment she clicked send, a part of her died. The girl who loved literature and dreamed of shaping the future was gone. In her place was a provider, a survivor. The next Monday, her new life began. It was a life fractured into 3 parts, a relentless cycle of exhaustion. Her days started at 4:30 a.m. in the pre-dawn darkness. She would take the first metro into the city center to the gleaming corporate district of Pardieu. There, as a cleaner for an office services company, she moved like a ghost through silent, empty towers of glass and steel. She emptied bins filled with the remnants of other people's success, wiped down conference tables where million-euro deals were made, and vacuumed carpets more plush than any she had ever walked on. She was invisible, a shadow tidying up a world that no longer saw her. By midday, her second job began. She worked as a waitress at a bustling, no-frills cafe near the train station called Le Coin Rapide. Here she was all too visible. She spent hours on her feet navigating a chaotic dance of impatient commuters and tourists, balancing trays of coffee and croissants, her pockets heavy with a few precious coins and tips. Her smile became a uniform, a mask she wore to hide the bone-deep weariness. Evenings and weekends were for her third job, babysitting. This was the most painful work of all. It took her back into the wealthy arrondissements, into beautiful homes that echoed the life she had lost. She would play with children in sun-drenched gardens, read them stories in lavishly decorated bedrooms, and tuck them into soft beds, their parents paying her well to provide the care and attention she desperately wished she had the time to give her own brothers. She would return late at night to the gray silence of the sous-sol, the scent of another family's happiness, still clinging to her clothes, a cruel reminder of all that had been stolen. She moved through her days fueled by cheap coffee and sheer will. Sleep was a brief, dreamless abyss. Food was often an afterthought. She would eat the leftover bread from the cafe or give her portion of their meager dinner to the boys, claiming she wasn't hungry. Her existence had been stripped down to a single burning purpose: to keep the promise she had made in that empty, echoing living room. She would take care of them, no matter what. Years began to blur into one another, each marked not by holidays or birthdays, but by the relentless rhythm of survival. The damp, cramped apartment in Les Verrières, once a symbol of their fall, slowly transformed into something else, a home. It was a fortress built not of concrete but of shared hardship and unspoken vows. The smell of mildew never truly left, but it was now layered with the smells of their life. The cheap, hearty lentil soup that simmered for hours on the stove, the scent of Sammy's worn-out trainers by the door, and the faint, clean aroma of the soap Ilara used to hand-wash their clothes in the bathtub. Their promises to each other were not spoken in words but in actions, in the quiet rituals that gave their fractured lives a semblance of order. Ilara was the axis around which their world turned. She was a phantom of perpetual motion, leaving before her brothers woke and often returning after they had fallen asleep. They saw the evidence of her love in small, tangible ways: a perfectly mended tear in a school uniform, a single treasured pain au chocolat left on the kitchen counter as a treat, the electricity bill miraculously paid just before the final warning. They saw the toll it took on her in the deepening shadows under her eyes, in the way she'd sometimes fall asleep at the dinner table for a few seconds before jerking awake with a small apology. Karim, no longer a boy, became her silent partner in this grim enterprise. He shed his youth like an old coat, assuming the mantle of responsibility with a quiet, uncomplaining dignity. He was the one who got Rayan and Sammy up for school in the mornings, ensuring their faces were washed and their homework was in their bags. He learned to navigate the bustling, chaotic outdoor market, becoming a shrewd bargainer for bruised vegetables and day-old bread. He would sit with Ilara late at night, a single lamp illuminating the pile of bills between them. His young face set with a seriousness that broke her heart. He never once said, "This is too hard." He only ever asked, "What's next?" Sammy appointed himself the family's minister of morale. His humor became sharper, faster, a necessary defense against the encroaching despair. When they were eating lentils for the fourth night in a row, he would declare, "Excellent. At this rate, we will be so full of iron, we will be magnetic. Think of the money we'll save on metro tickets." He teased his brothers mercilessly, started epic thumb wrestling tournaments, and did terrible impressions of their teachers, all in an effort to coax a smile onto their faces. But beneath the jokes, Ilara saw a deep, watchful empathy. He was the first to notice when her shoulders slumped with a particular weariness. He would appear at her side with a cup of weak, oversteeped tea and say, "Drink this. You look like a sad ghost." In those moments, she saw that his laughter was not an escape from their reality, but a way to make it bearable for the rest of them. Rayan remained the most fragile. The fall in the courtyard had left an invisible scar on his soul. He was quiet, prone to nightmares, and flinched at loud noises. For a long time, Ilara worried he was retreating into a world she couldn't reach. Then one evening she came home to find him sitting on his bed, humming. It was a complex, haunting melody she recognized instantly, one of the pieces their father used to play in his workshop. He didn't have an instrument, only the music living inside him. From that day on, music became his anchor. He had a pure, clear voice, a gift from their mother. Ilara nurtured it with everything she had. She couldn't afford lessons, but she found old songbooks at flea markets. She encouraged him to join the school choir, even though it meant stretching their budget to its breaking point for the required uniform. Hearing him sing was like hearing a piece of their past resurrected, a beautiful, hopeful sound in the concrete silence of the sous-sol. Their one inviolable tradition was Sunday morning. No matter how exhausted she was, no matter how little money they had, Ilara always made sure they had the ingredients for crepes. On Sundays, the tiny kitchen would fill with the smell of warm batter and melting butter. She would stand at the stove, flipping the thin, lacy pancakes while her brothers argued over who got the first one. They would eat them sitting crowded around their small table, topped with a dusting of sugar or a smear of cheap jam. It was their weekly communion, a declaration that they were still a family, that there was still room for a small joy. One crisp autumn afternoon, Kareem came home from school looking troubled. He needed a new winter coat for a mandatory school trip to the mountains. The one he had was too small, its sleeves halfway up his forearms. Alara's heart sank. A new coat was an impossible expense. That weekend she told the boys she had picked up extra shifts and would be home late. Instead, she went to a consignment shop and sold the only valuable thing she had left, a simple gold locket her mother had given her. It was worth more than a coat, but she used the money to buy the warmest one she could find for Kareem and new scarves for the other two. When she gave it to him, Kareem's eyes widened. He felt the thick insulated material, saw the sturdy zipper. He looked from the coat to her, a dawning understanding on his face. "Where did you get the money, Alara?" he asked, his voice low. "I told you extra shifts," she said, avoiding his gaze. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press. He simply put on the coat. "Thank you," he whispered. That night, as she slept on the lumpy sofa to give the boys more space, he quietly draped an extra blanket over her. It was his way of saying, "I know what you sacrificed. I see it." These were their silent promises, the promise of a warm coat, the promise of a shared blanket, the promise of a joke in the darkness, the promise of a song. They were the threads, invisible but unbreakable, that stitched their broken family back together, creating a tapestry of love so strong that no storm could ever tear it apart. It was a Saturday in early spring, one of those rare, luminous lion mornings when the sun seemed to wash the gray from the city. For Alara, it was a day of calculated freedom. She had managed to swap her weekend shifts, giving herself a precious few hours to do the weekly shopping at the Marché de la Croix-Rousse. The market was a vibrant, chaotic symphony of life. The air buzzed with the chatter of vendors, the smells of pungent cheese, rotisserie chicken, and fresh flowers, all mingling together. For Alara, it was a battlefield. She moved through the crowds with a focused intensity, her mind a running ledger of cents and grams. Her target was not the gleaming displays of artisanal olives or the perfectly stacked pyramids of organic fruit. It was the bins at the back of the stalls, the ones filled with slightly bruised apples, misshapen carrots, and day-old bread sold for a fraction of the price. Every centime saved was a small victory against the gnawing anxiety that was her constant companion. She was haggling over a bag of potatoes, her worn coat pulled tight against the morning chill, when a laugh cut through the market's cheerful din. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, yet recognized instantly, high, silvery, and dripping with disdain. Her blood ran cold. She looked up, her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. There, standing by a stall selling expensive handcrafted chocolates, were her uncle, aunt, and cousin. Uncle Antoine looked relaxed and prosperous in a cashmere scarf. His wife Helene was examining a box of truffles with a bored expression, and between them stood Céline. 4 years had transformed her cousin from a sullen teenager into a striking young woman. She was the very picture of effortless Parisian chic, dressed in a stylish trench coat that probably cost more than Alara's entire monthly budget. A designer handbag was looped over her arm. They were a portrait of serene wealth, a family from another universe. Alara's first instinct was to flee, to melt back into the crowd, to become one of the nameless faces her relatives would never notice. She turned away quickly, her back to them, pretending to be intensely interested in a pile of onions. But it was too late. "Mon Dieu, I don't believe it." Céline's voice was closer now, laced with a cruel amusement. "Cousin, is that really you?" Alara's shoulders tensed. She had no choice but to turn around. She composed her face into a neutral mask, her chin held high. "Hello, Céline." Céline's eyes, a pale, sharp blue, swept over Alara from head to toe. It was a slow, deliberate inspection designed to humiliate. She took in the cheap, faded coat, the worn-out boots, the faint shadows of exhaustion under Alara's eyes. A triumphant, cat-like smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. "We heard you'd fallen on hard times," Céline said, her voice loud enough for the people at the nearby stalls to hear. "But this is quite the spectacle. You look like you've been sleeping in the gutter. Tell me, what dreary little hole are you living in now?" Alara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. People were starting to stare, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding between the beautifully dressed girl and the shabby one. She could feel their pity and their judgment. "We are fine," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to finish my shopping." She tried to step past, but Céline moved to block her path, a small, malicious glint in her eyes. She was holding a steaming paper cup of coffee. "Oh, don't be like that, cousin," Céline purred, gesturing with the cup. We're family after all. We worry about you. All that responsibility, it must be so draining." As she said the word draining, she made a small theatrical stumble. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the entire contents of the cup splashing down the front of Alara's coat. The coffee was scalding hot. A sharp, searing pain shot through the thin fabric, biting into the skin of her chest. Alara gasped, stumbling back more from the shock than the pain. A dark brown stain spread rapidly across the pale gray of her coat. For a moment, there was a collective intake of breath from the small circle of onlookers. "Oh, clumsy me." Celine exclaimed, her voice ringing with false apology. She didn't look clumsy. She looked utterly delighted. Her parents watched from a distance, their faces impassive. They made no move to intervene. This was beneath them. The physical pain was intense, a burning fire on her skin. But the fire of humiliation that scorched her from the inside out was infinitely worse. To be assaulted, shamed, and made a spectacle of in public by the very people who had orchestrated her ruin, it was a new level of cruelty. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and furious, but she would not give Celine the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her mind flashed to her brothers, to Karim's quiet strength, Sammy's defiant jokes, Rayan's fragile hope. She was their shield. A shield could not afford to shatter. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the pain and the rage down. She looked directly at Celine, past the expensive clothes and the mocking smile, and into her cousin's cold, empty eyes. There was a stillness in her gaze, a profound and unnerving calm that Celine had not expected. Alara said nothing. She didn't accuse. She didn't retaliate. She simply held her cousin's gaze for one long, silent moment. Then, with a dignity that was a weapon in itself, she turned her back on her and walked away. She didn't run. She walked with a steady, measured pace through the parted crowd, her head held high. She could feel their eyes on her back, on the ugly spreading stain that marked her. She left the market, her shopping unfinished, her mind a white noise of pain and fury. She walked for 10 blocks. The burning on her chest, a dull throb, before she ducked into a deserted alleyway, leaned her head against the cold brick wall, and finally let the silent, scalding tears fall. 6 years. 6 years they had lived in the basement, 6 years of grinding poverty and relentless work. The boys were no longer boys. Karim was 21, a serious young man studying engineering at a local technical college, his tuition paid for by a patchwork of scholarships and the money he earned working nights as a security guard. Sammy, 19, was all lean muscle and restless energy, his wit now a sharp tool he used to navigate the world. Rayan, at 17, was the tallest of them all, his quiet nature concealing a fierce artistic soul. His voice trained only by the school choir, and his own relentless practice was a thing of astonishing beauty. The apartment, once a place of shame, had become a testament to their resilience. It was still cramped, still damp, but it was meticulously clean. Karim had fixed the leaky faucet Sammy had painted over the water stains with a cheerful if slightly uneven coat of white paint, and the sound of Rayan's singing often filled the small space, a constant defiance against the gloom. The change came on a cold, rainy Tuesday in November. It started with a loose brick. The wall in the boys' bedroom had always been a problem. A section behind Rayan's bed was crumbling, the old plaster flaking away. That afternoon, annoyed by the constant dusting of plaster on his pillow, Sammy decided to fix it. He wasn't a craftsman like his father, but he had inherited a practical, stubborn streak. "That's it," he declared, pulling the bed away from the wall. "I'm tired of sleeping in a sand dune. Karim, pass me that spackle we found." As he chipped away at a particularly loose section of plaster, his trowel hit something solid that wasn't brick. It gave a hollow thud. Curious, he worked his fingers into the gap. A section of the wall disguised to look like a row of bricks came loose in his hand. Behind it was a small, dark cavity. "What in the world?" Sammy muttered, peering into the hole. Rayan and Karim gathered around, their interest piqued. Sammy reached into the darkness, his fingers brushing against something wrapped in oilcloth. He pulled it out. It was a small, flat package, surprisingly heavy for its size. They carried it to the kitchen table, their makeshift laboratory for all important discoveries. With a sense of reverence, Sammy unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside was a notebook. It was a simple ledger bound in worn, faded red leather, the kind their mother used to use for her restaurant finances. But this one felt different. Alara arrived home at that moment, weary from her shift at the cafe, her feet aching. She stopped in the doorway, seeing her 3 brothers huddled around the table, their faces illuminated by the single overhead bulb, a look of awed gravity on their faces. "What is it?" she asked, her own fatigue forgotten. Kareem looked up, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite read. "We found something. Behind the wall." He pushed the red notebook towards her. Alara's breath caught. She recognized her mother's elegant looping handwriting on the first page. The date was from a month before the accident. The title read, "Pour l'avenir de nos enfants," for the future of our children. Her hands trembling, she began to turn the pages. It was not a journal of thoughts or feelings. It was a meticulous record. Page after page listed detailed descriptions of violins, not the ones their father made to sell, but others. Guarneri, 1741. Le Rossignol, Stradivarius, 1703. L'Âme Sœur, Amati, 1668. Next to each entry was a series of numbers and codes and the name of a secure storage facility in Geneva, Switzerland. "What is this?" Sami whispered, leaning closer. "Papa never said he had these. They were his secret collection." Alara murmured, a distant memory surfacing, her father speaking in hushed tones about custodianship, about protecting instruments too precious for the world until the right time. He had called them his ghosts. She had thought he was being poetic, but there was more. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the notebook were official-looking documents. They were from a Swiss bank, the Crédit Alpin Privé. They detailed the establishment of a blind trust funded by a series of quiet private sales of other instruments over the years, sales made to discreet international collectors. The names of the beneficiaries were listed clearly: Alara, Kareem, Sami, and Rayyan Nouri. And then she saw the conditions of the trust. It was to remain untouched, accumulating interest under the management of the bank, until two conditions were met. All minor children had to complete their secondary education, and the eldest beneficiary, Alara, had to reach the age of 25. She was turning 25 in 2 months. The final page of the notebook was a letter, a single sheet of paper in her father's the stronger, more angular script. "My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, something has gone wrong, and your mother and I are no longer there to guide you. This notebook is your map. It is the key to the future we built for you. Your uncles do not know of this. It was a secret your mother and I kept a firewall against any misfortune. Do not speak of it until the time is right. The men at the bank are bound by duty and will not act until you come to them of age and with your brothers secure. Trust in the law, my brave girl. But more importantly, trust in yourself. The violins are your inheritance. The money is your security. But your love for one another, that is your true legacy. Your loving Papa." The room was silent save for the sound of the rain tapping against the high window. Alara looked up from the page, her vision blurred with tears. She saw not one but 4 pairs of eyes, her own included, staring at each other in stunned, world-altering disbelief. 6 years of scrubbing floors. 6 years of hunger, of shame, of patched clothes and mended shoes. 6 years of her youth sacrificed drop by painful drop. And all this time a fortune had been waiting for them, hidden behind a loose brick in a crumbling wall. It wasn't just a fortune. It was proof. Proof that their father had been meticulous. Proof that their parents had loved them fiercely and had provided for them beyond measure. And it was proof of the breathtaking scale of their uncle's betrayal. They hadn't just stolen a home. They had stolen a future. They lied. Sami said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The jokester was gone, replaced by a man simmering with a cold, hard rage. They lied about everything. Kareem picked up one of the bank statements, his engineering mind deciphering the figures. He looked at Alara, his face pale with shock. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "this isn't just some money. This is millions." In the quiet of the basement apartment, with the rain falling outside, the red notebook lay on the table like a bomb that had finally, after 6 long years, just exploded. And in the epicenter of the blast, 4 orphans looked at each other and knew their world had just changed forever. The long climb was about to begin. The discovery of the red notebook did not bring instant relief. Instead, it plunged them into a new kind of turmoil, a breathless, urgent state of clandestine activity. The basement apartment, once a shelter of resignation, became a secret headquarters, a war room. They spoke in hushed voices, the weight of their secret a constant, palpable presence. The notebook was their sacred text, and they guarded it with their lives. Alara knew they couldn't act on emotion alone. Their uncles were powerful, wealthy men with the resources to crush them if they made a single misstep. They needed more than just the notebook. They needed irrefutable proof, a legal strategy, and a champion who would believe their story. The quest for truth began with Alara. During her precious few hours off, she no longer rested. She took the bus to the city's central library, the Bibliothèque de la Part Dieu. Surrounded by the quiet hum of scholarly pursuit, she began to dig. She learned about probate law, estate fraud, and the intricacies of Swiss banking secrecy. She filled pages of a new notebook with notes, her handwriting small and precise, her mind once starved of academic challenge, now razor-sharp and hungry. Karim applied his methodical engineering brain to the problem. He spent hours online cross-referencing the names of the violins from their mother's ledger with auction records and scholarly articles on historical instruments. He built a spreadsheet, a stark clinical accounting of their stolen legacy. The numbers he uncovered were staggering, confirming what the bank statements hinted at. The collection wasn't just worth millions. It was a treasure of immeasurable cultural and historical significance. He also investigated his uncle's finances, discovering a trail of lavish expenditures that began shortly after his parents' deaths, a new villa in Aix on the Côte d'Azur for Antoine, a portfolio of questionable real estate investments for Luc. The pieces fit together with a chilling mathematical certainty. Sammy, with his natural charisma and ability to talk to anyone, took on the role of field investigator. He revisited their old neighborhood, not as a resident, but as a ghost. He spoke to shopkeepers and old neighbors, casually bringing up his family, gauging reactions and gathering whispers. He learned that their family's old apartment had been sold with suspicious speed to a development company with known ties to Luc. He reconnected with the son of their parents' old solicitor, Maître Bernard, and learned that the elderly lawyer had been devastated and confused by the Rousseau brothers' takeover of the estate, but had been bullied into silence, convinced he was too old to fight them. But they knew this wasn't enough. They were 4 young people with a fantastic story and a handful of documents against 2 established, respected members of Lion society. Every law firm they researched seemed too big, too corporate, too expensive. They needed someone who would fight for the principle, not just the fee. The name came from an unexpected source. Rayon's choir director, a kind woman who had long championed his talent, listened with growing horror as Alara, driven by a desperate hunch, confided a carefully edited version of their story. The director gave her a name. Isabelle Dubois, she said, writing it on a slip of paper. Her family is from Martinique. She's young, she's brilliant, and she has a fire in her belly for cases like this. She specializes in fighting for the underdog. Her office is small, but her reputation is fierce. The name Dubois resonated with Alara. It was the same as their old neighbor, Madame Dubois, the stern woman on the balcony. It felt like a sign. Maître Isabelle Dubois' office was a cramped 2-room space above a bakery, the smell of fresh bread, a comforting contrast to the sterile environment of most law firms. The woman herself was not what Alara expected. She was young, barely 30, with intelligent, piercing eyes and a calm, centered energy that immediately put Alara at ease. She wore her hair in elegant braids, and her smile was warm but no nonsense. Alara, with Karim by her side for support, laid out their story. She started from the beginning. The slap, the fall in the courtyard, the 6 years in the basement. Then she placed the red notebook on the desk between them. Isabelle listened without interruption. She examined every page of the notebook, her expression growing more intent with every detail. She studied the bank statements, Karim's research, Sami's notes. When Alara finished, the lawyer leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Alara's face. "This is the most audacious act of fraud I have ever seen," Isabelle said, her voice a low hum of controlled anger. "They preyed on your grief, your youth, and your heritage. They counted on you being too poor and too broken to ever fight back." For the first time in 6 years, Alara felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This woman didn't just see a legal case, she saw the injustice. She saw them. "Can you help us?" Karim asked, his voice thick with emotion. Isabelle looked at the 2 of them, the sister who had sacrificed everything and the brother who had become a man overnight. She saw the shadows of hardship in their eyes, but she also saw an unyielding strength. "Help you?" Isabelle said, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. "Monsieur Nouri, I am going to dismantle your uncle's lives piece by painful piece. We are not just going to get your inheritance back, we are going to get you justice." She agreed to take the case on contingency, her payment a percentage of the final settlement. That evening, for the first time in 2,190 days, the four Nouri siblings sat around their kitchen table and felt the undeniable, earth-shattering tremor of hope. The quest for truth was over. The fight for justice was about to begin. With Maître Isabelle Dubois at the helm, the atmosphere in the basement apartment shifted from one of clandestine research to focused strategic preparation for war. Isabelle was a whirlwind of controlled, efficient energy. She filed motions, subpoenaed records, and dispatched investigators to Geneva. The trickle of evidence they had gathered became a flood. She unearthed the fraudulent documents Maître Moreau had filed, proving he had acted without proper authority. She obtained sworn affidavits from Maître Bernard, their old family solicitor, detailing how the Rousseau brothers had sidelined him. The Swiss bank, bound by their own protocols and now faced with a formal legal inquiry, confirmed the existence and staggering value of the Nouri Children's Trust. The case was built brick by irrefutable brick into an impenetrable fortress. The first shot was fired not in a courtroom, but through a registered letter. Isabelle sent a formal notice to Antoine and Luc Rousseau outlining the full scope of their alleged crimes: fraud, theft, child endangerment, and breach of fiduciary duty, and informing them of the impending civil lawsuit. The effect was immediate. The arrogant silence they had maintained for 6 years was shattered. Within 48 hours, Isabelle received a frantic call from a senior partner at one of Lyon's most prestigious and expensive law firms. They requested an urgent meeting, a preliminary discussion to clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding. Isabelle smirked as she relayed the news to Alara. "They're panicking," she said. "The powerful only call for a misunderstanding when they know they've been caught. They want to measure our strength. They want to see if they can intimidate us into a quick, quiet settlement." The meeting was set for the following week, a formal mediation session to be held in the neutral territory of a downtown conference center. Isabelle was firm on one point. "You all must be there," she instructed the Nouri siblings. "Karim, Sami, Rayan. They need to see you, not as the broken children they threw away, but as the men you have become. They need to see what they created." Walking into that conference room was one of the hardest things Alara had ever done. The room was opulent, with a long mahogany table and sweeping views of the city a world away from their basement. On one side sat their uncles, flanked by two sharp-suited, stony-faced lawyers. Antoine looked thinner, his face etched with new lines of stress. Luc was as still and silent as ever, but Alara could see a faint tension in his jaw, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly. Then Alara and her brothers walked in with Isabelle leading them. They were not dressed in expensive clothes, but in the best they owned their attire clean and neat. But it was their presence that commanded attention. Karim, broad-shouldered and solemn, his gaze direct and unflinching. Sami, his usual restless energy honed into a sharp, watchful intensity. And Rayan, now a head taller than Alara, possessing a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him. They sat down opposite their uncles, a united, formidable front. The change in Antoine's demeanor was visible. He had been expecting the weary, defeated girl from the market. He was not prepared for this composed, steely-eyed woman, flanked by 3 young men who looked ready for battle. Alara Antoine began attempting the same smooth, condescending tone he had used 6 years ago. "I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding. We acted only with your best interests at heart." Isabelle cut him off before he could continue. Her voice was calm, but as sharp as broken glass. "Maître," she said, addressing the lead lawyer opposite her, "let us dispense with the pleasantries. Your clients, the Messieurs Rousseau, orchestrated a multi-million-euro fraud against 4 orphaned minors. They systematically liquidated assets, concealed the existence of a multi-generational trust, and knowingly condemned their own niece and nephews to years of poverty and neglect. The only misunderstanding is if you believe we are here to ask for anything less than total restitution, punitive damages, and a public reckoning." The room fell silent. One of the uncle's lawyers began to bluster about unproven allegations and slanderous accusations. But it was Sami who spoke next, leaning forward slightly, his eyes locked on Luc. "Best interests?" he said, his voice low and laced with contempt. "Was it in Rayan's best interest when you pushed him to the ground for crying? Was it in Alara's best interest for her to work herself to collapse while you bought villas on the coast?" Luc flinched, a barely perceptible reaction, but everyone saw it. Karim's voice followed, colder and more methodical. "We have the bank records. We have the deeds of sale. We have a sworn statement from the freight company that purchased our father's workshop equipment for 1/10 of its value with the payment made to a holding company in your name, Uncle Antoine. We have everything. Antoine's face, which had been pale, was now turning a blotchy red. He looked at his lawyers, expecting them to save him, but they remained silent, their expressions grim. They knew. "This is a family matter," he finally sputtered, falling back on the old excuse. It should not be handled like this. It was Rayan who delivered the final blow. He had been silent until now, but when he spoke, his voice, rich and resonant, filled the room with an authority that belied his years. "You stopped being family the day you slapped our sister," he said, his eyes on Antoine. "You stopped being family the day you left us in a basement and stole our future. We are not here as your nephews. We are here as the children of Jean-Luc and Anissa Nouri, and we are here to reclaim their name and everything you took from it." The confrontation was over. The mediation had failed before it even began. There would be no quiet settlement, no sweeping of secrets under the rug. As Alara and her brothers stood to leave, she saw the look in her uncle's eyes. The arrogance was gone. The condescension was gone. All that remained was the raw, primal fear of men who had been caught cornered and were about to face a justice they had thought themselves far too powerful to ever have to answer to. The trial began on a crisp, clear morning in early February. The Palais de Justice de Lyon, with its imposing neoclassical columns, felt like a temple dedicated to a god they could only hope would be on their side. The courtroom was packed. The story had been leaked to the press, and the salacious details, a hidden fortune, stolen violins, orphaned children, and wealthy villainous uncles, had created a media frenzy. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and courtroom artists sketched the faces of the key players. Alara sat at the plaintiff's table, Isabelle Dubois by her side. She wore a simple dark blue dress she had bought from a second-hand shop, the most expensive piece of clothing she had purchased in 7 years. Behind her in the front row sat her brothers. They were no longer a defensive huddle, but a solid wall of support, their presence a silent testimony to everything she had fought for. Across the aisle, the Rousseau brothers sat with their legal team. They looked smaller in the cavernous courtroom, their expensive suits unable to conceal their pallor. Céline sat behind them, her face a mask of defiant boredom, though she nervously shredded a tissue in her lap. Isabelle's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She walked the jury through the timeline of the fraud with devastating precision. She was not just a lawyer, she was a storyteller painting a vivid picture of calculated greed and familial betrayal. "The defendants did not just steal money," she said, her voice resonating through the silent room. "They stole a childhood, they stole a future. They condemned 4 grieving children to years of poverty, struggle, and public humiliation, while they themselves lived in luxury off the inheritance of the very victims they were meant to protect. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a conspiracy driven by greed and a deep-seated prejudice against the legacy of their sister's husband, a man of Algerian descent whose success they could never stomach." She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the forged documents, the bank records tracing the flow of stolen money into the Rousseau's accounts. The photographs of Alara's basement apartment contrasted with glossy pictures of Antoine's seaside villa. The case was a mountain of facts, cold and immovable. The defense, led by a silver-haired barrister named Maître Giroux, tried to portray the uncles as well-meaning guardians overwhelmed by a complex financial situation. They argued that they had acted to protect the children from a fortune they were too young to handle. But their narrative began to crumble with the first witness. Isabelle called Madame Dubois their old neighbor. A formidable woman in her late 70s, she walked to the stand with a stern dignity. "I saw it all," she testified, her voice clear and strong. "I saw them carry their father's beautiful tools out of that apartment. I saw those men the uncles watch as those poor children were thrown out onto the street. And I saw Monsieur Luc," she said, pointing a trembling but resolute finger, "shove that little boy Rayan to the ground. That is not protection. That is cruelty." But the most powerful testimony came from the brothers themselves. Karim took the stand first. He was calm, articulate, and methodical. He spoke of the responsibility Alara had shouldered, the dreams she had abandoned, the endless shifts she had worked. "My sister was 19 years old when she became our mother, and our father," he told the jury, his voice steady. "She could have walked away. She could have let the state take us. Instead, she gave up her entire future to ensure we had a chance at one." Sammy was next. He brought a spark of his old humor to the stand, but it was now edged with steel. He told the jury about their pancake sundaes, about Alara selling her locket for a winter coat. Then his voice turned hard. "We learned to laugh when we wanted to cry," he said, looking directly at the jury box, "because we saw our sister working herself to the bone and never once complaining. She taught us that dignity isn't something you buy, it's something you hold on to when you have nothing else left. The emotional climax of the trial came with Rayan. Now 18, he had the poised confidence of a performer, but as he spoke, his voice broke with the memory of their struggle. There were nights he began his voice soft, but carrying to every corner of the room. I would pretend to be asleep, and I would hear her crying in the living room, quietly so she wouldn't wake us. She cried because she was tired and because she was scared and because she didn't know how she was going to pay the rent. But every single morning she would get up and she would make us breakfast and tell us that everything was going to be okay. And because she believed it, he paused. Taking a deep breath, we believed it too. He looked across the room at his uncles, his expression not one of hatred, but of a deep, profound disappointment. What we needed wasn't a mansion or a trust fund. What we needed was someone who wouldn't give up on us, someone who would keep their promises. That's what our sister gave us. When Maître Giroux, the defense attorney, tried to cross-examine him, his question seemed petty and cruel. Wouldn't you have been better off with proper adult supervision, with financial stability? Rayan's response silenced the courtroom. Maître, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. Alara didn't just supervise us. She loved us. She sacrificed her youth, her health, her everything. You talk about financial stability. She gave us something more valuable. She gave us a family. Can you put a price on that? He had not just answered the question. He had answered the entire premise of the defense. As he stepped down from the stand and walked back to his seat, placing a supportive hand on Alara's shoulder, a quiet understanding settled over the courtroom. The case was no longer just about money. It was about the definition of wealth itself. And in that courtroom, it was clear to everyone who the truly rich people were. The defense's case unraveled with startling speed. Maître Giroux put Antoine Rousseau on the stand, a last-ditch effort to reclaim the narrative of the well-meaning guardian. But under Isabelle Dubois' surgical cross-examination, Antoine's composure disintegrated. Monsieur Rousseau, Isabelle began, her tone deceptively calm. You testify that you were concerned about a 19-year-old's ability to manage her family. Were you also concerned about her ability to manage a multi-million-euro trust fund? We did not know the specifics of the trust, Antoine stammered, avoiding her gaze. But you knew of its existence, did you not? You knew your sister and her husband had established a fund for the future of their children. It was complex. There were debts to consider. Indeed, Isabelle pressed, holding up a bank statement. Like the debt for this 40,000 euro watch purchased 1 month after you evicted your nephews, or the down payment on your villa paid for by the liquidation of your brother-in-law's priceless violin collection. Were these the debts you were so concerned about? Antoine's face was a mask of perspiration. He mumbled, he contradicted himself. He lied poorly. By the time Isabelle was finished with him, his credibility was in ashes. His brother Luc, seeing the disaster unfold, invoked his right to remain silent, a move that spoke louder than any testimony. In her closing argument, Isabelle did not just address the jury, she spoke to the conscience of the room. For 7 years, the defendants have lived a comfortable lie, she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. A lie purchased with stolen money and built on the suffering of children. Today, that lie ends. Today, you are asked to do what the defendants never did to protect this family, to restore their name, to return their future. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The tension in the courtroom was a physical entity when they filed back in. Alara held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Karim, Sami, and Rayan leaned forward in their seats, a single unit of hope and fear. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a kind, serious face, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. She cleared her throat and looked not at the judge, but directly at the Nouri siblings. In the matter of Nouri versus Rousseau, she announced, her voice steady and clear, on the charge of fraudulent misappropriation of assets, we find for the plaintiffs. On the charge of breach of fiduciary duty, we find for the plaintiffs. On all counts, we find for the plaintiffs. A collective gasp, then an explosion of relieved whispers swept through the room. Alara felt a sob escape her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated release. Sami grabbed Karim in a fierce hug, while Rayan buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was over. They had won. The judge, a man with a stern but fair reputation, brought the courtroom to order with a bang of his gavel. His ruling was even more decisive than the verdict. He ordered the immediate and unconditional release of the entire trust fund to the Nouri children. He ordered Antoine and Luc Rousseau to repay every centime they had stolen with interest. He imposed punitive damages so severe that it would effectively bankrupt them, stripping them of their ill-gotten homes, cars, and investments. But he wasn't finished. There is one final item, the judge said, his voice softening for the first time. During the investigation of the deceased's bank records, a key was discovered to a safe deposit box. The contents of that box were entered into evidence. It contained only one item, a letter from Jean-Luc Nouri to his children to be opened in the event of his death. A court officer handed the sealed envelope to Alara. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The judge nodded. "You may read it aloud." "Mademoiselle Nouri, if you are able." Alara stood, her brothers gathering protectively around her. She looked across the courtroom at her uncles, their faces gray with defeat, and then she began to read her father's words, her voice gaining strength with every sentence. "My dearest children, if you are reading these words, then the unthinkable has happened, and your mother and I are no longer with you. There are no words to express our sorrow for leaving you so soon. Know this above all else, everything we worked for, everything we built, it was all for you. The violins and the trust I have established will ensure that you never have to worry about money. But that is the least important inheritance I leave you. More than that, I pray you will always have each other. Alara, my brave, beautiful girl, I know the greatest weight will fall on your shoulders. You have your mother's courage and a strength you do not yet know you possess. I trust you to keep our family together. Take care of your brothers, my love, but do not forget to take care of yourself, too. Your dreams matter. Karim, my son, you have my hands and my sense of responsibility. Use both to build, to create, and to guide your family with a steady heart. Sammy, you have your mother's laughter and her irrepressible spirit. Never lose that light. Even in the darkest of times, your family will need your joy. And Rayan, my little songbird, you carry the music of our ancestors in your soul. Follow your art, for it will lead you to truth and beauty, but never forget where you come from. I have left you enough to live comfortably, but I have tried to give you something more valuable, the values that make good people. Love each other, support each other, forgive each other's mistakes. Be the family your mother and I always dreamed you would be. All my love for all of time, Papa." By the time she finished, silent tears were streaming down Alara's face. There wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Even the stoic judge seemed to wipe at his eye. The letter was not just a final message of love, it was a vindication. It was the ultimate testimony, a voice from beyond the grave confirming everything they had fought for. The legal victory was sweet, but the reclamation of their parents' love in their own words, in a public forum that had witnessed their humiliation, that was the true justice. The money was a tool for the future. The letter was the healing of their past. The years that followed the verdict were a study in reconstruction. The money, a figure so vast it seemed abstract, was released to them. But they soon learned that while wealth could erase poverty, it could not erase the habits of survival. The first thing Alara did was buy them a house. Not a sprawling, ostentatious mansion, but a beautiful old stone house in the Saint-Foy-les-Lyons hills overlooking the city. It had a large kitchen with a long wooden table, sun-drenched rooms, and a garden with rose bushes and a sprawling oak tree. After 7 years in the gray confinement of the sous-sol, having spacelight and the scent of damp earth after rain felt like the most profound luxury imaginable. For months they all struggled to adapt. Sammy would hoard food in his cupboards, a deep-seated fear of scarcity still lodged in his bones. Rayan kept his lights on all night. Karim would obsessively check the bank account balances, unable to fully believe the security was real. And Alara, for the first year, continued to wake at 4:30 a.m., her body still programmed for the relentless cycle of her 3 jobs, her heart pounding with a phantom anxiety before she remembered she was safe. With financial freedom came the liberty to pursue the dreams they had been forced to abandon. Karim transferred to one of France's most prestigious engineering schools, the INSEE Lyon. He graduated at the top of his class and started his own sustainable engineering firm, specializing in urban renewal projects in underserved communities, a clear tribute to the concrete towers they had once called home. Sammy, channeling his restless energy, traveled the world for 2 years before finding his calling. He enrolled in culinary school, rediscovering his mother's passion. He eventually opened a restaurant in the heart of Lyon, not a high-end gastronomic palace, but a warm, vibrant bistro named Le Carnet Rouge. It served modern Franco-Algerian cuisine and became a beloved local institution, famous for its lively atmosphere and the owner who greeted every guest with a joke and a genuine smile. Rayan's musical career soared. He was accepted into the Conservatoire de Paris, where his raw talent was polished into a breathtaking artistry. His debut album, titled Sous-Sol, was a haunting collection of songs about loss, survival, and hope. It became a critical and commercial success, winning him the French equivalent of a Grammy. He used his platform to advocate for music education in the banlieues, ensuring that other children with a song in their hearts would have a chance to be heard. As for Alara, she discovered she had her father's meticulous mind and a formidable talent for business. She didn't just manage their inheritance, she grew it investing with a shrewd, cautious intelligence. But her true passion was the Nouri Foundation, which she established as a living tribute to their parents. The foundation provided grants to young independent artisans and scholarships for first-generation immigrant students facing hardship. Every young luthier she supported, every student she helped stay in school, felt like a victory against the forces that had tried to break her own family. She finally found love not by searching for it, but by allowing herself the peace to be found. She met Luke, an architect she hired to design a new wing for a community arts center funded by her foundation. He was a kind, steady man with laughter in his eyes, completely unimpressed by her wealth. He loved her for the quiet strength he saw in her, for the story she carried in her heart. They married in a simple ceremony in the garden of their home, with her 3 brothers standing beside her. Justice, they found, was not a single event, but a slow, unfolding process. Karma, it turned out, was a patient accountant. Antoine and Luc Rousseau were ruined both financially and socially. Ostracized by their community, they lost everything. Antoine's wife left him. Luc descended into bitter alcoholic obscurity. Celine, stripped of her wealth and status, was forced to take a menial job, her public humiliation a constant nagging echo of the one she had inflicted on Alara in the market so many years ago. One day, nearly 10 years after the trial, Alara received a letter with a shaky, unfamiliar handwriting. It was from Antoine. Alara, it read, "I write this not to ask for forgiveness, for I know I have no right to it. I only write to tell you that I understand now. We were poisoned by jealousy. We resented your father's talent, his happiness. We saw his success not as his own, but as something that should have belonged to us. We justified stealing from children because our own hearts were bankrupt. Watching you and the incredible men you raised, I have come to see the true depth of my monstrosity. Your father would have been so proud. I hope you find peace." She showed the letter to her brothers during one of their weekly Sunday gatherings. The long table in her kitchen was now crowded with their spouses and their own children, a new generation of Nouris, who would only know the Sous-Sol as a story, a family legend of resilience. They talked about the letter, the anger of their youth now tempered by a quiet, somber pity. They had gained everything that mattered while their uncles had lost it all. Alara never wrote back. There was nothing left to say. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, her husband found her standing by the window, looking out at the glittering lights of Lyon. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "Sammy's daughter asked me a question today," Alara said softly. "She asked if I was sad about the bad years. And I realized I'm not. I regret the pain. I regret that my brothers had to see me struggle. But I don't regret what those years made us. They forged us into a family that could never be broken." She thought of her father's letter, of his final wish for them to be a family. She looked around her beautiful, light-filled home, a place of peace, built from the ashes of a great injustice. They had not just survived, they had thrived. They had taken the ugliest of betrayals and transformed it into a legacy of love, creativity, and compassion. The money was their inheritance, but their journey, their unbreakable bond, that was their heritage. And it was priceless.